Dr. Kyle Gillett, arguably one of the biggest problems that people have with the entire even idea of Ozempic or Semaglutide, the GLP-1 receptor agonist, is muscle mass loss. And it's a very viable concern, but there's a brand new study that came out that kind of flipped a little bit of this on its head with the co-administration of something. And you're the man to describe this study and talk about the details of it. Just give us the lowdown on it.
I bring these creatine stick packs everywhere. There's no sugar in them. It's pure creatine sweetened with monk fruit. That's the patented, tried and true creatine monohydrate that's out there. And that is a 50% off discount link with those stick packs. So 100% sugar-free. They've got some awesome flavors. They've got a lemon lime flavor. They've got a berry flavor. They have an unflavored version if you want zero flavoring whatsoever. And the cool thing is, it makes it so I can just sip on it throughout the course of the day. I like that. I like the idea of sort of micro-dosing my creatine, so I'm not having larger boluses. The literature shows that when you load with large boluses, that's when you might have more of the water retention. So I like just sipping on it throughout the course of the day. So 50% off your first order with Create and their creatine stick packs. So that link is in the top line of the description underneath this video.
Yeah, this study was done with one group that took just semaglutide, older individuals, one group that took semaglutide plus enobosarm, which most people are familiar with because it is Ostarine, or MK2866. I always say the more letters and numbers something has, whether it's a peptide or a SARM, which this is a SARM, the better the efficacy and the less the side effects. So in this study, I believe there's about 150 individuals, and props to the individuals at the academic institutions that ran this study. It was well done, and it was placebo-controlled, and the results are as expected. The individuals that took the semaglutide plus the Ostarine lost essentially no lean body mass. Unfortunately, this does not mean I'm going to stop recommending, good protein in the diet and resistance training. And it also does not mean that you can take as high of a dose of GLP-1 like semaglutide as possible. But this is a fantastic step that we're studying new molecules, because Ostarine is basically a type of atypical hormone replacement therapy. And we're open to looking at functional outcomes, including body composition and the ability to, they did some sort of test where they had them climb sets of stairs or climb a hill, and that functional outcome was also preserved.
So what is Ostarine? I mean, I've heard about it talked a lot. I mean, what is the basic idea of a SARM, and what is Ostarine? What is its mechanism?
A SARM is a selective androgen receptor modulator. So that means the same receptor that testosterone and DHT bind, there's only one of them that we know of. It's called the androgen receptor. It binds this receptor, except instead of activating it like testosterone or DHT, it activates it in some tissue like muscle and inactivates it in other tissues. So it's more similar to a SERM, which is a selective estrogen receptor modulator. People may have heard of Clomid or enclomiphene or tamoxifen, which is Nolvadex, or even raloxifene. And those just activate and inactivate estrogen in certain tissues. And we actually use this for hormone replacement in some females, and sometimes we use it in males. But it's basically a step forward that in humans, we are studying SARMs more often for things other than prostate cancer and breast cancer, which are the two other conditions for which this has been studied.
So in essence, for potential muscle building, you're potentially getting muscle growth without the shutdown and without the side effects, or as little side effects.
Correct. Yes, less side effects. Now, females can absolutely still virilize, which is masculinize if they take this, because it does drop that SHBG protein. That's the protein that binds up all androgens and estrogens. So if you have very high testosterone and thus DHT naturally as a female, it can free that up. But it also is going to cause you to metabolize your testosterone faster. So anybody on a SARM like this, you expect to see low testosterone and low estrogen because you metabolize them quickly. And you also expect to see high bad cholesterol, low good cholesterol, and high liver enzyme levels. So it does have very specific side effects. And if you give it to males without TRT or HRT, then it will decrease your testosterone significantly.
While you're taking it, or does it come back after cessation?
while you're taking it, and it comes back a little faster than it would be if you're doing some sort of injectable TRT. Okay. But it does suppress your testosterone up to several weeks after you stop taking it. So it's very common for you to feel pretty bad a few weeks after you stop.
So if we come back to semaglutide in the first place and why people lose muscle mass with it, in your opinion and based on what you've seen, is it really just the severe caloric restriction that tends to occur, or is there another mechanism independent of that might trigger a little bit more muscle wastage?
It's a good question, and I would separate this into two questions. Do GLP-1s cause you to break the laws of thermodynamics? No. And compared to an isocaloric diet, so if you just have someone be very, very strict on what we call a VLCD, very low calorie diet, you do lose the same amount of muscle mass. It's just exceedingly difficult to do. So it makes it too easy, in my opinion, to over-restrict your calories. However, the second part of the question is, does it cause you to have a lipolysis more, which is the chopping up and breaking up of fat molecules? And the answer to that is absolutely yes, especially in areas that are not as common. For example, buccal fat. There was this trend probably 5 or 10 years ago called buccal fat removal. They'd have a plastic surgeon remove the buccal fat, kind of makes you look leaner. It's out of style now. So now people are having fat transfer put back in, which is actually a great way to do it. Ozempic faces another entire discussion. But that's one of the side effects. But one of the good things about that for people on GLP-1s is very difficult to lose fat areas like in the abdomen are also chopped up faster. That's called lipolysis. So once you break up this fat, it's easier to use to burn compared to if you were not on a GLP-1.
Interesting. Yeah, I want to spend a couple minutes on the facial fat piece. Like, what would you recommend people do that are on a GLP-1 receptor agonist? I mean, if they don't want that Ozempic face, like just chewing gum, things like that, does that actually make a difference?
Chewing gum does not help you have less fat, but it does help the aesthetics of the face. Okay. But for females specifically, it can masculinize the face. So your buccal fat is here, but you also have a muscle called a masseter muscle. And chewing gum, and there's some evidence for this. My brother's a dentist, but in my opinion, and from what I've talked with many oral surgeons and orthodontists and dentists about, is if you chew gum with a mouth that's too wide open, then you are going to increase your chance of TMJ, which is actually just a joint. We call it TMJ, but it's the temporomandibular joint, and it can become inflamed. So inflammation of temporomandibular joint is often secondary to too much opening of the jaw. But you can have a very strong masseter muscle in your face, and that makes it look like you have less facial volume loss. Some people also inject calcium hydroxyapatite crystals, which are naturally in our bone and collagen, but that's called Radiesse. But that also is it mimics collagen and elastin more than it mimics fat. So in general, I wouldn't recommend just chewing gum for that. But if there's another reason to chew gum, I think it's reasonable. And it can, to some degree, masculinize the face, which most men want and most women may not want. In fact, some women specifically get Botox or similar in order to atrophy that muscle.
Interesting. Yeah, I've definitely seen in my experience, maybe it's different for you, but men seem to get that Ozempic face more so than women. I notice it, but maybe it's just more noticeable because when a man's face shrinks, it's really noticeable. And a woman's, you're not demasculinizing as much as you would with a male, right? Because it doesn't see, is that just why, or does it not impact women as much? I just don't see a whole lot of women walking around super sucked in from Ozempic, but the guys, the older men that I see take it, they get that drawn in look.
I think that it does impact the women as much. I think that there's just, and this is my opinion, I think there's a greater propensity to go to places like med spas where they can very easily get filler, which I'm generally not a fan of, or biostimulator, which is what we do, like Radiesse we do in our clinic. You can get many ways. We don't need to go into the details of it, but I think certainly women are more likely to seek that out because they want to prevent that sinking in of the face look.
Interesting. And then in terms of things that would accelerate sort of the muscle loss with Ozempic, I mean, would you, let's just say you had a hypothetical patient that wanted to, drop 30 pounds. They weren't like very, very overweight. They wanted to drop 30 pounds. Would you advise them against excessive cardio, or would you advise them like, hey, back off the cardio, focus more on resistance training, like particularly with women, right? Where it's like cardio they usually have a high affinity for cardio.
Yeah.
And so what's the direction there as a practitioner? Like, where do you usually guide people?
Yeah. obviously individualizing their plan is most helpful and assessing where they're at, because some women do fantastic with resistance training and some men do fantastic with cardio. But I always make the joke that you just take your male and female clients or patients and you just switch their regimens. So the males start doing some cardio because they're doing none, and the females start resistance training because they're doing none. So you balance out their regimens. And I think that you can certainly do some of both. In my opinion, the biggest thing to help prevent too much fat loss is just decreasing the dose or using a different GLP-1. For example, tirzepatide is actually a weaker GLP-1, but it's a dual incretin. So it has more mechanisms. But for some people, you might want a stronger GLP-1 effect.
Yeah. So if you're looking at, say, well, first of all, let me back up. How long does it usually take for someone to start having the muscle loss? Like, is it usually within a couple of weeks? Is it a couple of months? Does it depend on how restricted the calories are?
Mm-hmm. Actual loss of lean, dry muscle tissue takes several months, just like accruing it does. However, if you're doing DEXA scans or even an in-body scan, I'm more of a fan of DEXA scans because you also track bone mass, and it does not matter as much as far as like intracellular and extracellular fluid shifts. But basically, let's say you're doing DEXA scans, which is analyzing their body composition. Within 1 week of starting a GLP-1 at its standard starting dose, you are very likely to see your lean body mass go down 5 or 10 pounds. That's just fluid shift because water in the muscle, called sarcoplasm, it's the cytoplasm of the muscle cell, that is going to decrease significantly. And that's what we call wet muscle. So that's why when you hear people like Derek talk about lean, dry muscle tissue, that is actually pretty difficult to track.
Gotcha.
And then when you stop your GLP-1 or when you stop your keto diet or when you add salt back in, if you're salt restricting, or when you start creatine, then it looks like you've gained a lot of lean muscle mass, but it's water.
Is there a practical application for creatine in terms of muscle preservation when using a GLP-1 agonist?
Definitely.
Yeah.
And people who can't tolerate creatine, which is a decent amount of people, the gut health side effects, yes, creatine monohydrate is in general the best and generally the best tolerated, but I do have some patients anecdotally that have tolerated the liposomal creatine better. And then some people that tolerate crealkaline better. There's a very individual to individual aspect of that. So I would just try each of the different types. Just because creatine monohydrate in general is the best according to experts does not mean that you should not try another type.
Yeah, it seems to be a mixed bag in terms of people's, what has worked well for them. I mean, I've heard people, monohydrate is cheap and easy to get, but I've also heard a lot of people say, hey, I retained less water with HCl. It's like, and that happens to be the case with me. I do like monohydrate and I typically use monohydrate. I don't really care about a little bit of water, but if I am focused on water, actually HCl does seem so contrary to what some people will say. And I'm with you. Bang for the buck, monohydrate makes a lot of sense. And I know that can be particularly an issue with women. They don't want the water retention, right? So that's and I don't want to get off topic here, but does the water retention typically wear off? Like once you acclimate to a certain dose of creatine after, say, a month or so, does the water kind of chill?
Yeah, generally I tell people it's half better after 2 weeks and 90% better after a month.
Yeah, you just got to stay on it. Because I think that's the biggest concern I have with women and creatine is not being consistent with it. They see this, 1 week bump and they're like, oh my gosh, I got to get off of this stuff. And then they, it's just like this constant roller coaster of it. And then they never actually get the effect because they're constantly going up and down, up and down. So what are there, these other sort of GLP-1 receptor agonists and kind of compounds that are coming out? You've got regular semaglutide, you've got tirzepatide, you've got retatrutide. Is that how you say it?
Yeah.
It's always a hard one to say. What are the differences between those?
Yeah, so GLP-1s are a type of incretin molecule. DPP-4s were kind of before that, and GLP-1s have been much better. But you have GLP-1, GIPs. You also have triple incretins, like retatrutide, that also includes glucagon. And this sounds like a bunch of gobbledygook word jargon. Yeah. And I guess it is, but the main takeaway is between these GLP-1 class molecules, there's a difference in how much growth hormone you get. And if you're a triple incretin and you have glucagon, you're extremely likely going to get the most growth hormone. People might be familiar with growth hormone peptides from our previous podcasts. But GLP-1s, especially triple agonists like retatrutide, are very potent growth hormone releasing peptides, which might be a good thing if you have very low growth hormone to start.
Yeah.
But if you have an active tumor, you do not want a whole bunch of growth hormone. That's why we don't use HGH off-label like we did in the 90s. But a couple other GLP-1s that people don't know about, which I think are particularly interesting. One is liraglutide. You have to inject it generally daily, sometimes every other day, but really daily. But that is generic, so that's a good option for some people. Also, dulaglutide, which used to be called Trulicity. It still is Trulicity, but that is likely to be on the shortage list for quite some time. So for some people, that's going to be particularly interesting because it does work quite well, and it's a once-a-week injection.
Interesting.
So the original one was exenatide, which is just kind of the same as an Gila monster venom, and that was Bydureon and Byetta. But liraglutide and subsequent GLP-1s are much better than that. But the next, I guess, class of GLP-1s is going to be combos. They're going to be comboed with amylin agonist, like we talked about last time. Your cagrilinotides. We spoke about that. James and myself spoke about that on our last Gillett Health podcast. And that's going to be very good for type 1 diabetics or diabetics that have completely dead beta cells in the pancreas, which is the cell that produces insulin and amylin.
Is there any application for healthy people using these for better glucose uptake or anything like that, or is it really just people that are metabolically dysfunctional or type 2 diabetic?
Yeah, certainly there is. Like anything else, the same thing as HRT or TRT, you're weighing all the benefits on one side of the scale and all the risks on the other side of the scale. Yeah. And for people that have prediabetes or insulin resistance, the benefits almost always outweigh the risks.
Yeah.
For people that have a high risk of neurodegenerative disease, that's another potential off-label prescribing reason. And another reason is for people who have good metabolic health, but they have some degree of pancreatic inflammation. Maybe they've had a virus and their A1C and fructosamine are running high, their CGM data just does not look correct. And I think it's also reasonable in that case.
Interesting. And can it potentially course correct that entirely, or is it just while you're using it?
There does appear to be some degree of legacy effect. There was one study that studied all GLP-1s. These are the old ones that weren't as good. I wouldn't say weren't as good. They weren't as powerful. Yeah. Because sometimes you want a less powerful GLP-1. And at least a few weeks after you stopped, you have something called a legacy effect, where you had continued good health of the beta cells of your pancreas that produce insulin and amylin even after stopping. So I do believe it has somewhat of a permanent effect. And of course, it can help your body weight set point too.
Yeah. Which kind of brings us back even to the Ostarine thing. If you are using something like Ostarine and maintaining muscle mass while you're dropping fat, then when you do come off of it, you're going to have a better chance of maintaining your success, not having a basal metabolic rate crash. What's the, I don't know if you know the statistic, what's the average sort of weight regain for someone that's just doing a standard GLP-1? Is there a statistic, or is just, I've heard that it's quite a bit, but it all depends on probably the person and their mindset going into it and coming out of it.
Yeah, so there's been a couple large trials on this, and James and I have discussed this at length on the Gillett Health podcast. In fact, I believe Dr. Taylor Martin and I have also discussed this when it came to heart rate changes. But most people in the study, something like 80% of people, will regain a significant portion of their weight, if not, more than half their weight after stopping it. And a lot of people gain back all of their weight if they stop them cold turkey from the highest dose. But in the last couple of years, slightly smaller, but I would say more realistic studies in the real world were done, where they're very aggressively implementing diet and exercise interventions, and only about half of them regain any significant weight. And in our practice, we see less than half of people regain any weight after we wean people off GLP-1s.
Interesting.
The dose does make a difference. I believe one of the trials was called the SURPASS trial, but for stronger GLP-1s, it does appear that they regain more weight.
Yeah, well, that would make sense. It's just kind of the same as if someone is to rapidly lose weight without a GLP-1, it's just going to be that yo-yo effect, a little bit more aggressive. So it's, even though from a standpoint of, I can't remember the paper, but essentially, whether you lose weight fast or slow, it kind of doesn't matter if you have things under control, but for most people, dropping weight really fast is not enough time to implement true lifestyle change. And that's kind of where we run into an issue. So you've got someone, okay, they do a crash 8 weeks on a GLP-1 and they don't actually change their habits. They just eat less. Then, okay, yeah, you lost a bunch of muscle. You're going to go right back to your original diet. You're probably going to rebound and be worse off than you were before. What would you say, like, for someone that is well, actually, you talked about DPP-4, which is interesting because I haven't heard a lot of people talk about that. There's foods that increase DPP-4, right? That kind of have this, and that essentially prolongs the life of GLP-1, right? So I didn't realize that there was a pharmaceutical intervention for that. So that was the original application. Was it in essence to prolong your natural GLP-1? Is that kind of what a DPP-4 would do?
Correct. In my opinion, the DPP-4 didn't really have any benefit outside of its GLP-1 effect.
Okay.
So we just skipped to the true benefit. And also, GLP-1s had much better outcomes data, which is where we're looking at, how did this actually help in the real world? Not just the numbers, but did people have, less heart attacks and less diabetes in the future?
Because DPP-4, it's basically keeping it so that the half-life of like GLP-1 is, it's really only a couple seconds, right? It doesn't last very long. So it's just enough I'm imagining to send a pulse and ultimately signal to the brain to say, I think is it GLP-1 then goes to PYY or neuropeptide Y, is that kind of, and then the sequence, and then there's like a GABAergic effect too that kind of, so you're probably just prolonging that just enough for a signal to get to the brain. Is that?
Yeah, although if you take GLP-1s with DPP-4s, it doesn't seem to help.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, because because the hard part to ascertain is that foods that are high in have DPP-4 inhibition effects are also usually very high in fiber. Or high in protein. So it's like, okay, well, what is it that's actually doing it? Is it just the actual mechanical digestion effect of having more fiber and protein, or is it the fact I would imagine the DPP-4 inhibition effect of certain foods is probably minuscule. It's probably not having that much of an effect, or at least not superseding that of the fiber itself, right?
Yeah. And it's also hard to study the DPP-4 effect without also taking the GLP-1 effect into account. Because GLP-1 is considered a gustatory peptide. So you might have two different people, and if one person likes this food significantly more, they might have more of a delayed GLP-1 effect. For example, most foods with fat have more of a delayed GLP-1 effect. Very delayed, even 12, 18 hours later.
Wow,
but
really?
Some people who like one food more might have more of that effect just because they particularly like that food.
Interesting. Also, very easy to overeat fats very fast before you actually get that effect. Probably why bulletproof coffee is not the best idea.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons. Yeah, or for pretty much any liquid calorie for that matter.
Yeah, is there? Again, kind of going in a different direction here, but I'm actually curious. If you liquefy fat, like in some liquefied butter in bulletproof coffee, how it affects on a chylomicron? Does that actually increase the rate of absorption and ultimately serum triglycerides in the short term and potentially lead to more fat accumulation faster?
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I would assume it does, but I don't know. For those who don't know, chylomicrons is how your body absorbs fats like triglycerides, but VLDL is kind of how it transports endogenously made triglycerides, which is kind of more genetic. And people can genetically have lots of chylomicrons and lots of fat absorption too. But I would assume that just the effect of faster stomach emptying would affect fat absorption, but I don't know if the body would have its digestive enzymes kick in time. So I've always thought the main downside of like liquefied butter and drinks like that is if you're not going to digest it, then you're going to have steatorrhea, which is malodorous floating stools. It's kind of one of the other concerns.
For me, one of the only things that really derails me are liquid calories. Like liquid calories that just don't work for me. Protein shakes aside, like having like a low calorie, 120 calorie whey protein shake is one thing, but liquid calories, smoothies, shakes, those things, one of the only things that I can see affect me very, very quickly. So I'm not particularly a fan.
What about non-fat Fairlife milk?
I'm more of a fan of, I do like Fairlife milk. I'm more of a fan of Pioneer Pastures now. Have you seen that one? Yeah, going more into from the traditional like regular milk category, Fairlife and Pioneer Pastures are very, very similar. Pioneer's just A2 milk, which is nice to see them actually
nice.
making. So they're making, it's Fairlife, but A2.
A2.
Which is great, like true A2. And then they now have the protein shakes, which are the same as Fairlife, but with A2 and with monk fruit instead of sucralose. So
Nice.
yeah, I mean, I have to disclose I'm an investor in them, but they can't even keep it on the shelves in Target. Like that's really badass. So it's, but yes,
I do like that.
That's, I mean, same concept though. I don't dislike Fairlife. Like until Pioneer Pastures came around, honestly, I would just, like my fridge is always stocked with like fat-free or 2% because it tastes like whole. I mean, it's pretty awesome. And that's, for my wife, Amber, like it's hard for her to get protein in. It's just hard to get her to sit down and eat protein sometimes. Like she's just on the go all the time. She's more likely to just like not eat or eat like a moderate sized lunch and then like not eat breakfast or not eat dinner. It's just kind of how she rolls. So like I have to like almost like just give her Fairlife milk just to like get that protein up. And it's an easier way to do it.
That's probably fantastic in Ninja Creamies. That's what I've been doing recently is just lots of Ninja Creamies. Not to derail our conversation, but
it's been derailed multiple times. We're in a different place now. So. But I mean, bringing it back to the brain for a second, there is a mild effect with GLP-1 agonists and a cognitive benefit too, right? Yeah. How does that work?
Yeah, so there's a couple different ways, but in general, your brain has this system called the limbic system, which is the emotional control center of the brain, and incorporates things like your hippocampus, which also has to do with directionality, and your amygdala, which has a lot to do with emotions, but can also make things like kisspeptin, and your hypothalamus, which is the general control center of the brain for many things, including temperature. Cravings are very important in that area as well. And that's why GLP-1s are studied and how they affect things like gambling or risk-taking or even addiction, like various addictions. And the GLP-1 peptide does have a direct target. So it does have receptors in all of those areas of the brain, but there's also likely a downstream effect because if your glucoses are better, I mean, it's the same discussion as people on ketogenic diets. Is it the ketones directly acting on the brain, which they certainly do, or is it because there's less hyper-excitation of those neurons, or both? Is it 50-50? Is it 20-80? Is it 80-20? I think that at least half of it is the GLP-1 directly binding in those areas of the brain.
Interesting. I mean, and that's, is there, if you're on these GLP-1s, is there enough time to actually rescue metabolic function in the brain to a certain degree? Like if you're giving your brain essentially a break from this excitation all the time, is there an application where like, hey, you can actually remedy or rescue some of these, like this metabolic dysfunction in the brain as a result?
Certainly in cases of what we call type 3 diabetes, I think so. Type 3 diabetes you can think of as pre-dementia, and you also meet criteria for type 2 diabetes. So I think in those cases it's particularly helpful. Same thing with potentially even a ketogenic diet in those cases, and taking exogenous ketones and maybe even doing hyperbaric oxygen as well. I know Dr. Scott and others and Dom talk about topics like these from time to time. But I think that there's certainly a case to be made that would be your best candidate, if that makes sense. Yeah. But there's a lot of other, let's say someone has meningitis or even a TBI, and maybe they can't exercise a lot. Maybe they're coming back from a combat zone overseas, or they're a UFC fighter and they're out with a broken leg and a TBI. Yeah. I think there's a case to be made.
Yeah, it seems like it. I mean, I think just even for the regular person, that's just, when I say regular person, I mean a regular metabolically dysfunctional person, since most Americans are, unfortunately. I think there's an application to sort of give everything a break from the constant overload, and maybe give people at least a fighting chance on feeling a certain way, and hopefully want to hold on to that, and do what they can to feel a way maybe they haven't felt in 15 years or 20 years, and be like, hey, wait a minute, if they can understand that, okay, it's not necessarily the drug making me feel this way, it's the downstream effect of not eating less, and also, okay, this is what I can feel like if I'm retain this. I think we probably haven't. Is there a GLP-1 sort of application when people come off of, say, their main dose, and just like a once a week or a once every 2 week dose, just to kind of keep appetite at bay a little bit so it prevents regain? Can you like taper them off over the course of 6 months? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I taper all my patients off GLP-1s, which can be tricky because sometimes insurance does not want to cover below a certain dose. And, that's a that's something that you can visit with your doctor. But there's a reason why there's multiple Super Bowl commercials just about what I call cookie cutter GLP-1 clinics. Yeah. It's tough to be a lifestyle first physician and emphasize your diet and your training, but then also realize that probably more than half of adult Americans could benefit from at least a low dose of a GLP-1. Yeah. It's just important that they're on the same page and they actually know what the downsides are. That's why I think, at some point people are going to be saying, people are Ozempic sick, and they're going to look back on them just like other popular trends. There seems to be a tide, and the last 5 years, GLP-1s have just been wildly popular, and I start to see the social pressure pushing back against them, but they're still just as good of medications. But as far as the average person benefiting, at 1,000-foot view, you want to use it as a crutch. It's fine to use crutches. If you have a broken leg, you use crutches to get yourself back on your feet again and training again. You don't use a wheelchair that just wheels yourself around, and that's what you use instead of doing the lifestyle work. Use it to augment the lifestyle work that you already have.
Yeah. Well, the last question I have on this is, I found that a lot of people that take GLP-1s end up having almost an aversion to fats in some way. Like they just I think maybe just the idea of a greasy meal. They're not so. A, have you found that too? B, have you noticed in any of your patients that their omega-3 index shifts radically? Like, are you noticing okay, you're not getting adequate fats in, and what I think it's like the ugly redheaded stepchild that no one really talks about when it comes down to this. Like talk about not getting enough protein, but I haven't seen a lot of people talking about the fatty acid profile and kind of focusing on that, because that would be a concern for me, especially when you're looking at the brain, right? It's just these people, almost everyone that I know that has been on semaglutide, they just want to eat like these light kind of dry meals. Like I think the affinity for fats just goes down.
Yeah, this is a pretty major issue, not just for people on GLP-1s. Most Americans and most people in general do not consume enough omega-3s, and they consume too many omega-6s. Yeah. So, of course, you can improve your diet or you can supplement with these. But the takeaway is, yes, you do need to watch your healthy fats in the diet, but you should also think about fat absorption. So GLP-1s can actually help absorption in some cases. In people that have very fast gut transit, it can slow down the gut. But of course, it can also cause the stomach to be paralyzed, called gastroparesis, or the intestines to be paralyzed, called ileus. That's why we have people stop at several weeks before any operation, because you can get post-surgical or post-operative ileus. But you can also slow down the gut so much to where you can't tolerate the fat, and then also where the enzymes are not going to digest the fat at the right time. So often, myself or our sports dietitians will have people taste something bitter on their tongue, whether it's ginger or apple cider vinegar or even lemon water, just enough to taste bitter about 5 to 10 minutes before their meal. That stimulates their natural digestive enzymes. We don't make as much money selling, functional med company digestive enzymes that way. Poor joke. We don't make any money off supplements, but I know a lot of people do. But that's a great way that you can stimulate your natural digestive enzymes to start when they might otherwise be delayed. And then the other way to counteract that is to consume things that specifically have your nutrient profile first. Let that digest through the stomach, and then you're taking your food as a supplement, I suppose. Even if you don't feel like it, maybe you need to decrease the dose of GLP-1 or become accustomed to having some degree of healthy fats in the meal.
That makes perfect sense. Well, Kyle, where can everyone find you, man?
My main hub is Instagram, Kyle Gillett MD, and Gillett Health on all other platforms.
Right on, man. Thanks, brother.
Thanks.